Ryan Turnip Seed, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. This Gauntlet format has been a major success. Now that a few of the episodes are out, I've been never have I contributed something to the internet that has been so glowingly approved of by the masses. Not that the opinion of the masses matters, of course, but
Well, I've seen the opinions of the creators. I think that Morgoth just put out this morning that he was very happy with this thing that he did with you. So, but
I
I
didn't see
haven't
that.
read that,
Oh,
nor have
good.
I watched any of it. So I have no unfair advantage going in here.
Morgoth's episode was very popular, so anybody who's watching this and hasn't caught up on the back catalogue, go and check that one out. Let's get underway. Music, economics, or cosmology?
Huh. Now, economics is the degree that I have.
Ooh,
And it's what I spend a lot of time on. Um,
all right. That sounds like a pretty sensible
so
direction.
Yeah, or I could go music and do
You're
something that we
also
were joking
accomplished
about.
in that realm as well, I gather.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd say accomplished like that. That implies that I've earned some distinction or something. I just I played music for quite a long time. I've got opinions on it. Um, I do think that music would be more challenging and thus more exciting for me, though. So I think I'm going to pick music.
Ooh, exciting. All right. Well, this is like a personality test now. Live music is more important than recorded music. Rhythm matters more than harmony, or jazz is dead.
Okay, I'm actually going to do the thing that I joked with you about before we started recording. I am going to argue that jazz is in fact dead. Um,
Exciting. Yes,
uh,
before before the show starts, I usually show guests the first round so that they get the idea of the format. And you were saying the one thing you're not going to do is pick jazz is dead. And here we are. So
yeah.
take it away.
Okay, so in the very earliest origins of jazz, most people argue that it came into being in New Orleans in the very early 1900s. The people playing jazz knew how to play their instruments by far. I think only a few of them were actually trained, but the vast majority of them had just picked up the instrument since they were little and played it for entertainment, much like they would have picked up piano playing for ragtime in a slightly earlier era. It was an entertainment measure, and that's also why they would play on the street side. They would play for people's entertainment or for celebrations or whatnot, and that would be their form of payment if they got any or wanted any. So it's a very sort of it's an organic cultural development, I think would be a good way to put it. And then even before then, the elements that went into making it came from very distinct musical traditions. I mentioned ragtime earlier. Marching band instrumentation was where they got the trumpets and trombones from. Even some of the rhythms and the harmonies come from Romantic era classical music. You can listen to the Symphonie Fantastique, the last movement, and you can kind of almost hear basically any recording, the string section trying to swing certain parts of it. Even the most professional recordings will do this. So you have these very distinct traditions that came together in one area due to cross-cultural interaction. And this thing sort of developed. And you had this happen in concurrence in a few other cities in the U.S. At the same time, where basically the same influences coalesce, and they got some influence from New Orleans, but it developed something different in each different geographic area with each different population. So you had this very organic cultural development. And then it even got picked up by popular media. This is where you get crooning and sort of like the orchestral jazz that you'll find in the 20s and 30s. I would even still argue that that's an organic cultural development. People found something that they thought the vast majority of the population would like, so they picked it up and commercialized it. I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. It happens to everything. It's how we get personal computers and whatnot else and outside the laboratories. I will argue, however, that jazz died whenever it was sort of formalized and codified. So the people that developed it were not looking out of music theory books or anything else. They were the stereotype is that they were playing from the soul or something like that. They were improvising. They were engaging in polyphony because this was something that they felt like playing. There was no, I was going to say there was no rhyme or reason to it. There was reason to it. It just was not codified. So this is why New Orleans jazz in the earliest recordings, the King Oliver's Creole, sounds far different from the jazz that you'll find on the radio during the time, or the jazz that you would find in Kansas City. It's all very much different. But as soon as you have these different companies trying to keep producing jazz for profit, sort of like a production line, and they start codifying it and saying, this is how you improvise, this is the theory you're supposed to use, this is the specific method that you're supposed to play with, this is how you compose jazz-like, this is the instrumentation you are supposed to use, this is how you get the 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, 4 or 5 saxophones, and the standard rhythm section instead of clarinets, trombone, or tubas, and all these other more interesting instruments that you'll find in the earliest parts of jazz. I argue that that's when it died. Just because at that point, you lose the sort of organic nature of jazz, and it becomes a very sort of artificial second genre of music that is completely distinct from the first organic jazz that you'll find from about 1900 to, say, 1950 is when I would put the cutoff. So
yeah,
that's my
going to
initial.
say, what's the cutoff? Because you've got the very distinctive New Orleans sound that you were talking about. But then in some ways, there were these other developments that happened, like swing, bebop, and then the kind of cool jazz stuff in the 40s that are quite different sounding to New Orleans. And in some ways, I don't even know that New Orleans is the sound that people most associate with jazz.
Oh, it's absolutely not.
So all the way up to the 50s, you're saying that's when it was real, that was the authentic stuff. And then post the 50s, you've got maybe people like Herbie Hancock, Miles Davis, sort of modal jazz, free jazz. There's kind of things go in a much more kind of experimental direction. In some ways, it reminds me of what was happening in classical music, but I think it happened earlier in classical music. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's
the
kind of
minimalism.
crazy, unlistenable stuff that people were doing at the beginning of the 20th century. Some of that sort of happens 50 years later in the world of jazz.
Yeah, and just to clarify my statement, I would actually say that a lot of stuff, even from the crazier stuff afterwards, is not necessarily it's not inauthentic. What I'm saying is inauthentic is whenever like a generation or two has passed, most of the jazz bands have disformed due to conscription laws and whatever else in World War II. That's how you get combos, if I remember correctly, was literally a lack of manpower for the bands. Glenn Miller disappears over the English Channel, and then you're kind of seeing the end of the big band era. After about a generation or two has passed, which is I laid out the 50 years, 1900 to 1950. You start to find it being codified in schools. People are going to be taught jazz theory in different conservatories or whatever else. I don't think conservatory would be the right word. Different classrooms. At that point, whenever it starts to get standardized and whenever people try to refine it down to its most basic elements, and it sort of stops being this organically developing thing. That's why I cut off at about 1950. I don't have the exact date, but it takes a couple of generations for jazz to be, number one, accepted, and so accepted and enough time has passed where it gets taught in schools to people that want to learn jazz the correct way or the textbook way. At that point, that's when I argue it died, and I'm just putting the date at around 1950 or so. So in that way, Miles Davis and the other Herbie Hancock, I would say, are a little bit more authentic than the stuff you get today, which is where people have this pre-planned virtuistic solo that they've drawn out beforehand. They've drawn out how the music theory connects for each different measure. That's just not what you would find early on.
I think if you trace through the real jazz purists, there has remained a number of people who are doing it properly, as you're describing, where they're not pre-planning stuff. There is still some degree of progression as well to the style, that there is a difference between contemporary jazz and jazz from 40 years ago, but there's just fewer people doing it, so I suppose the rate of change has dropped. But the people who are playing music in the 70s, as in if you're performing live jazz music in the 70s, but your sound comes from the 40s, there is something relatively inauthentic about that, in that you're kind of resurrecting a historical style. But then is that really any different from an orchestra today playing Beethoven's Fifth? And to kind of double down on this point, a lot of the great classical composers were great improvisers at the time, and
Yes, yeah.
their written score. I came across a really fascinating video the other day about Für Elise, that so Beethoven made this sketch that eventually got published. He didn't publish it at the time, but it was kind of discovered and later published that everybody knows Für Elise. He eventually prepared a version of it for publication, and he fiddled with it quite a lot, and it was very different from the thing that we all know that was his earlier sketch. And he still wasn't happy with it, so he didn't include it in the end in his publications. But it just goes to show that the very rote, rigid thing that people think of as Beethoven is quite different from the flexible, wild, ever evolving kind of living music that he was living at the time. Which is to say that all styles of music that are more than 10 years old are dead by that definition, right? Oh, I've just noticed that Turnip dropped, and I don't know at what point he did. So hopefully he'll rejoin in a second, but I'm just going to pause the recording. Sorry about that, everybody. Yes, so Turnip, I was just saying that at the time, classical musicians were as improvisatory. So if you're going to say jazz is dead, would you also say that classical music is dead and romantic music is dead?
Right, and I think that that's indisputable insofar as we say we're differentiating between the different kinds of what people typically call classical music. Baroque music has not been a living tradition for many years. Same with Romantic era music. It gave way at the start of the 20th century. With jazz, there's sort of a different way that we can go here that I was kind of avoiding just because of the mainstream sort of historiography, where we can just say as well, rock and roll killed jazz as sort of the popular musical medium of the time, just because that's where the pop industry started to go. You started seeing more ghost bands emerged as the old big band leaders died out or retired. So after you see rock and roll start to take off in the 50s, which also lines up with what I was saying, where it starts to get codified and sort of fossilized, if you will. At about that point in time as well, the public starts to drop it, which may or may not be organic, but it is indisputable that after about the 50s, my great grandma before she died would tell me stories about her parents and the rest of the town and whomever else would get together in the old grocery store. They would clear out a room, and there would be a jazz band that came to this small rural town, and they would start playing, and people would dance, and there would be a nice communal sort of social gathering. I did not hear about any of this happening after the 50s. This was all pre-50s.
Yeah. Now, I wonder whether there's a distinction to be made between so there's a style of music that's in the spotlight currently at any given time, but then there's also a style of music which has nobody or a diminished, to a handful of people who are even listening or playing that style at all. and in a way, when we say a style of music is dead, maybe we should reserve that only for the styles of music which really have diminished to a fraction, rather than just those that aren't under the full beam, the glare of public attention.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of why I was holding off on bringing out just that sort of mainstream historiography, just because I think they unfairly say that Baroque is dead because it's not the main thing anymore. Therefore, our jazz is dead, and we get this cool niche thing that we're keeping alive. Just because that's not entirely true, and that's not really what I see to be the real cause of death, if you will. Also, I think there's a pretty good argument that jazz may have killed itself, and this was something that I was talking about when I was still playing in jazz bands. Whenever you start having these very virtuistic solos, and you have these sort of like these main soloists within the bands and whatnot else, whenever you start having those things, it's a much more difficult for the audience to sort of just stay with that. It's much more difficult for them to enjoy that. It's not what you naturally have. Most people don't gather around on the street side corner or in these giant halls or whatnot else to hear someone have this absolutely crazy saxophone solo. Usually it's something that's more melodic, or polyphonic, if you will. Not someone, quite frankly, showing off. People don't tend to reward that.
There's a difference in music that you dance to and music that you listen to. I would argue
that is true.
Yeah. For the heyday of jazz that you're describing, it was dance music, and actually, the stuff that happened since the 50s is much more thinky, intellectual. It's pay your full attention and clap, kind of, with a level of sophistication at the end of it, where it's the in the 40s and 50s, it was just a bunch of young people like going out wildly dancing with a sort of joy. It's a very different spirit and community in those two eras.
Right. And this is why most people, except for like jazz musicians, have not listened to something like Giant Steps. The vast majority of people haven't, just because that's a very intellectual thing. It's very clearly written in the age where jazz has become an intellectual pursuit or a codified pursuit where you have set rules and you're trying to exceed them. Quite famously, people point out the pianist couldn't even keep up with Coltrane. If you're just listening to it to get some sort of enjoyment out of the music, or you're getting together or something, you're not going to play Giant Steps. It's a completely different thing than the earlier jazz forms. Even though it's technically lumped under the same genre, and even though we're supposed to pretend that it's a normal continuation of what developed out of New Orleans and Kansas City and out of the big bands and crooners.
I do think there is a certain naturalness to the progression, in the sense that, so if you look at, that scene in Back to the Future where he's playing heavy metal and the audience is kind of stunned, and he says, well, maybe this is a bit too early for you, but your children are going to love it. And the progression of rock music getting heavier and heavier was that they needed to amplify their guitars so that they could play to a giant room full of people dancing. When you amplified the guitar, if you push the amp hard enough, you get kind of a distorted sound. And then if it becomes from just a mere practicality to actually a taste, that we like the sound of a guitar being amplified as loud as possible to the point where it's breaking up. Let's keep pushing in that direction. I think you can see the same thing, that the very experimental modal jazz is lifting some concepts that came out of jazz theory organically and pushing it to the nth degree. And although the first time that you hear Giant Steps, it's quite hard to get your head around, but once it's become part of the lexicon, the Coltrane changes, is predictable and it's quite easy to listen to. And I'd argue the same
Right.
thing. Like the first time anybody heard "Rite of Spring," it was quite an offensive sound. But it's actually very similar to a lot of the John Williams music that people love, and it's very mainstream in movies. So all of these like progressions that happen in music is like a case of the public's tastes shifting slowly over time.
Sure. So I'll quickly respond to those few things because I don't know how much time we actually have left here.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, sorry. We've been going for 20 minutes, but that means we're going twice as slowly as we should. So we
okay.
I suspect you only have an hour. Is that true?
I can go for slightly longer and let you chop up things or whatever you want to do.
That's fine. Let's just keep going, and we'll try and speed up a little bit. But I'm happy to go over an hour.
Yeah. I'll wrap up the subject by responding to a few things here. Sure. So yes, there is a natural sort of intellectual progression, I guess I would say, from rock and roll in the 50s, getting weightier and weightier, heavier and heavier, until you basically end up with I guess the end of that train would be like metal. I guess would be a good place to say that that's where it naturally progresses to. However, much like jazz, whenever you sort of get this intellectual this idea that you need to take this to its logical conclusion, this thing that people just organically developed and enjoy, in any other category than music, we would say that's where that thing gave way to something new. So we do this with history all the time, especially people on the distant right, or in religion. So whenever we find ideas historically that may have worked somewhat well, and then we find that a few generations later, people saying we need to take this to its complete logical conclusion, and then they get into power, whatever else, we would say that this is a completely new era. The previous thing was gone. So whenever rock and roll gets pushed to its logical conclusion, which is metal, it's lost a lot of cultural weight. And that's not to say that no one listens to metal or anything like that. But rock and roll, or metal rather, was not the preeminent child of rock and roll. And when people say they like to listen to 80s music or something like that, it's much softer, or it's post-disco or whatever else. It's not usually metal. Much to the dismay, I'm sure, of Mr. McIntyre and a few other people in our spheres. So same thing with jazz. Most people say that they like to listen to jazz unless they're just a diehard autist. Usually they're not talking about the very technical things that came after the 50s. Usually they're talking about swing music or blues or something similar to that. Like the most popular jazz music that you will find in movies and all these other cultural mediums is going to be swing music. So you can play In the Mood, or I'm forgetting what was Benny Goodman's main thing. I'm gonna punch myself when I when this recording stops. Benny Goodman's main
Louis blues.
No.
Sing Sing Sing. Is that what you think?
Sing Sing Sing. That's it. Yes, the other main swing song. Most people have heard those before, and it's not just because they sought them out. It's because they were picked up by other cultural mediums, and they've kind of just withstood time. Like you can still find movies today where it's in like the background. If you need a jazzy scene or something like that, those songs are probably going to be in there somewhere. So you get this old thing, but very similar to how metal is different from rock and roll, even though it came out of it and it's not the preeminent thing. The very sort of the intellectual pursuit of jazz that happens after the 50s, say, it is something different. Old jazz is gone, and it's not in the spotlight anymore. Very few people are doing it. And we would qualify that as dead in any other topic, history especially. I don't know. I think I was going to respond to something else, but we're good.
Yeah, you've done exceptionally well in that round. I'm going to give you 16 points, which I know at this point you've got no idea where that stacks up. But let me tell you, that is a high score. Round two. Ethics, history, or metaphysics?
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna pick history.
What a surprise. Revisionist history is necessary to understand the past. The great man theory of history is flawed, or geography is destiny.
Ooh, okay. So the second two, it could get into a lot of minutia, which are not really what I'm inclined towards. Especially the geographic stuff, even though I used to be very interested in that. It's just not something I really excelled with. So I think I'm going to argue that revisionist history is absolutely necessary to understanding the past.
Great, take it away.
So, any historical... Okay, actually, no, let me start with something even more sort of abstract here. History is a subject that is based entirely on faith, I would say, because the vast majority of us do not witness historical events. We get told about them from people who have witnessed them. And this makes the subject inherently sort of faulty. You wouldn't accept many eyewitness events in other categories, and it's why anything historical or anything historical, say in law, you'll know in law that eyewitnesses are not like the end-all be-all. There's an element
like
of logic that's applied in all these other things.
If you go and look at eyewitness testimony from the assassination of JFK, that's a good example of everybody's witness statements conflict everybody else's on all the minute details. Like,
right, yeah.
You can pin almost nothing down based on eyewitness testimony in that case.
Right. And that's why in law it's not the end all be all. That someone says they saw you do something is not grounds purely for a conviction. And that you can apply this sort of more broadly with the discipline of history. So we know that Napoleon did X, Y, and Z, but it's only because people saw him do X, Y, and Z and wrote it down. And then we then take those accounts and accept them or reject them on faith, basically. We cannot logically prove that Napoleon would have done those things. We can say it lines up with things that he had previously done that we also accept to be true, or we can say this is fanciful because he was over here doing this other thing that we accept to be true. And this new account or old account contradicts this other thing that we hold to be true. So in this sense, I have viewed history as a discipline of faith. This means, however, unlike sort of like theological inerrancies and these other things that we get in the field of theology, this is entirely a man-made field, except out of like the gospel accounts or something like that. We have no assurance from any divine authority that the accounts that we accept to be true are actually true. This is something that we have to work out with trial and error, much like our scientific theories are not guaranteed to be true by some divine authority. We refine our equations and whatever else we have. So with history, revisions, even though revisionism is like sort of a code word now for very scary right-winger, or if you're in a leftist circle, it's evil reactionary or betrayer of the revolution or whatever else. Outside of this very modern idea of revisionism, it is revisionism that drove the discipline of history. And I can use the topic of American history to best explain this. When you had the American Civil War, the first chroniclers described it in terms of a narrative, sort of like this grand battle between two nations or civilizations or peoples. And they had these sort of other ideas that were intertwined into the narrative, like you would with any other historical chronicle in the sort of early modern times. And these were the first stories that we had about the American Civil War. And then the next generation that came after them took a much more sort of rigorously empirical approach. They would assess all accounts that they had of everything that happened during the Civil War, and then come to the conclusion that, well, most people say that X happened, therefore we will accept that X happened. This is sort of the Dunning School approach, where you assess every eyewitness account that happened during Reconstruction or right at the end of the Civil War, and then you use those eyewitness testimonies to then conclude that, well, Reconstruction was a very harsh policy that probably should not have happened, and the people that implemented it must have been malicious because look at all this destruction that people record. This is universally attested to by all eyewitnesses, perhaps in different degrees. So, but we can at least take the principle that this thing generally happened to be true, and therefore Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War was malicious, or it was absolutely devastating. And then you get after that sort of like a sort of reconciliation between the North and the South, which is where people now politically motivated are trying to find a sort of a concurrence between the two sides to where there's less division in the country. So you get the sort of both sides did wrong things, both sides did good things. We can all get along now. Here's like the neutral POV history of the American Civil War, and this would have came out in the 30s. And in fact, I have the main book that set this idea forth in my library. And this is a revision. Every single new historical school of thought that outlines these ideas is a revision of the old one. The Dunning School revised the sort of narrative histories that were laid forth immediately after the Civil War and in Reconstruction because it found it to be lacking. There wasn't as much direct proof in terms of eyewitness accounts or whatever else, and they found that to be unconvincing. Maybe it was downplaying some things. Maybe there were other agendas from the storytellers that were being hidden within their accounts that were obscuring what actually happened. And then the reconciliatory approach that came about in the 30s that revised the Dunning School. This was done, you can argue the motivations. And in fact, a lot of these sort of consensus type historians would argue that the Dunning School was overtly pro-Southern and looking for as much of a case that they could find against the North. So these reconciliatory types outlined their objectives before going in. I think people more critical to them would argue that they needed to find something that sort of absolved both sides and presented a more neutral sounding idea, and so tried to combine Northern historiography with Southern. In this sense, this is a revision. And then we get a new left revision after that that's mostly stayed with us, where we argue that, the historical field argues that the South was this evil, racist oppressor class that was conscripting poor yeoman farmers to fight their wars, and the North was sort of this greedy industrial power that accidentally did a good thing and freed slaves. This is sort of like the revision that most historical textbooks have now adopted. In this sense,
but when it's
revision,
the approved, when it's the broadly popular, fashionable revision, it's not thought of as revisionism, right? Revisionism is the word that's applied to people who are kooks or scary outsiders, with the kind of undertone that the broad thrust of historical knowledge is stable and well accepted, and then even, something like a critical theory or a feminist revisionism would not have that word applied to it. Like the kind of the left wing revisions that seem to be coming in waves are corrections to the incorrect establishment, but are somehow not connected with the idea of revisionism at all.
Right. So, and this is something you'll see is that at the outset, when this new idea that is revisionist is marketed, sometimes or usually they will embrace the revisionism. They will say, yes, these things are wrong, and here's why. These popular things. But as soon as they become sort of establishment or status quo, they drop it, just because it sounds. You can't maintain that you are an outsider revisionist while being the main textbook maker for the country. So, you can try, but most people aren't going to accept that. Especially if you just out and say it, which I don't think that has really happened. But in the sense of American history here, you can see that there are waves of revisions, and usually, up until perhaps recently, each revision tried to temper what came before it. If one accepts, which I don't, that this is done out of just a pursuit to be more accurate in history. Very naive, doesn't actually exist. But in theory, if that is what's happening, then revisionism is necessary to better understanding history. It's indispensable. Otherwise, you just end up with some status quo that is in all likelihood politically motivated from a side that was in power or ascended to power. So, drawing on what we know about how governments actually work, there are going to be different people that do get into power with different narratives, different truth claims, and whatever else. They're going to need some new history that sort of supports them. And this is where revisionism does come in. But also, as we know, this does not mean that everything that they say are wrong. Just because it's motivated by maintaining their power does not mean that they rely on falsehoods and fabrications only. So, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon was treated as an antichrist figure by a great majority of the continent. However, if you talk to basically anyone now about Napoleon, the vast majority of people would say, yeah, he was this great conqueror, or he spread liberalism to the continent, or he was a very important figure in French history, something like that. It's not going to be as emotionally charged. No one's going to really call him the Antichrist. And this is because of revisionism. This theory that Napoleon was this Antichrist figure coming out of France, destroying the whole continent, wrecking tradition and whatever else, and that's the only way that you can view him from, was itself a narrative that was later revised. And our great Thomas Carlyle was part of the effort to the effort to revise this history of Napoleon.
The bias of people at the time tends to be connected to the events in question, I would say, whereas the bias of later historians is that they want to use every historical event as part of their current day ideological battles. If they can retell a story from the past and use it to prove a point that's useful to them in the current day, then they will. Have you seen the film Memento, or do you know of it?
I don't actually know about it.
I hope it's not too much of a spoiler to say that the main character has a brain condition that leads him to have short-term memory loss. So he overcomes this by writing notes to himself, and he even has tattoos of key information. And it's a film mostly about that problem of an individual trying to maintain a link to his own identity in the past. But I think there's an interesting parallel here, that a society also kind of has this amnesia where I could even see it in the course of one decade. Things that happened that everyone experienced are immediately forgotten about. And if you want to frame a conversation that includes the existence of these things, you need to find evidence of it. And evidence only exists because something is created at the time and preserved, and then you can recall it. So you're starting out of this segment talking about how his history is often an act of faith, because you're relying on testimony and you're relying on a very scant amount of evidence, and yet we have the opportunity, as events are happening, to try to grab what exists, what we're seeing with our own eyes, and somehow project it forwards into the future. People thought that the internet would be this incredible technology for producing truth, but we seem to see, as quickly as tools come up that allow us to record, also tools come up that allow us to fabricate. And I mean, people have. It was often an atheist, a new atheist argument of, if God wanted Jesus's life and miracles and resurrection to be well attested, he could have picked a different time and place in history. Why didn't he appear today, for example, when everybody has the camera phones, and there would have been no doubt. But in
Right.
some ways, I actually think, because of the limitations of technology in the time and place in history when Jesus lived, it rules out quite a lot of potential fraudulent, the evidence that we do have is more trustworthy because of you can always, in any context that evidence about history can arise in, will have almost an equal amount of validity, because it will either be very detailed, strong, modern evidence with modern technology, but also modern ways of making forgeries, or it'll be ancient, scant evidence, but in a way easier to verify. So do you
Right.
think there's a time and place in history for which we can be the most confident about the details?
Not necessarily, but I will say one of the strongest reasons for Christian faith is the fact that we have four testimonies from completely different individuals, completely different classes, completely different backgrounds, different levels of education and whatnot, attesting to basically the exact same thing, with not necessarily different details, but different emphases on different details. The fact that we can find those four documents from the same time, or no, not the same time, from slightly different times within the same era, attesting to the same words almost of the same words and preachings of Jesus Christ. This is one of the strongest reasons to believe it. It's highly, highly unlikely that these people would have conspired with each other to write down their stories in the exact same way to dupe people into something. What that is always another point of contention if one does believe that. But the fact that we have those four accounts from these people that are named, that we know existed, and the fact that they attest to the same wordings, is one of the strongest arguments in favor of Christianity, just because we don't have that for basically any other event.
People will say that perhaps one of them was written first and then the others copied off that, or that there was an additional source that we've lost that all of the other gospel writers read from, or something like this. But then it's interesting, the other criticism that's leveled at the gospels is that they're inconsistent, that they contradict each other, so therefore they can't be true. I feel like you can't have your cake and eat it here, right? Either they're spookily similar because they're all collaborating, or they're contradictory because they're different people and they're all making it up. But because it lives in that overlap where it's getting both types of criticism, that actually makes me feel quite confident.
Well, even with the first kind of criticism, and this might tie into the main point about revisionism, is that successful revisionism does require an element of truth that people can see, because while the vast majority of people can accept lies, and it happens very frequently, it won't stay that way for very long. We would say that's not stable in whatever period of time you're evaluating a historical narrative. So if there was this secret document that the evangelists were reading out of the apostles and whatever else that we've lost,
humorously known as Q.
Yeah, Q. Yeah, if we take this Q-spiracy route,
the original QAnon,
right? Yes. If we take this, there's less evidence for that than any of the things that I just put forward. And then similarly, if we take this fact that they're contradictory, we're starting with some truth claim beyond just reading the history here. That is what informs us that they're contradictory, and that falls outside the realm of history. This idea that we have this moral claim that we say Evangelist 1 held that is contradicted by Evangelist 2. The way that we know that something is a contradiction is by some sort of underlying truth claim. So in that sense, that I would say that's sort of outside the scope of historical analysis, and entering into moral or metaphysical. But in regards to the first question, there's far more proof for the Christian interpretation of Christ's ministries than there is for a great deal of historical events that are accepted in the history books. We don't have very
Mm.
many accounts of even some early modern occurrences. Usually it's just like one or two courtiers that were, or aides to like a general or something, that wrote down this is what this general said and planned. And we accept that because we know that that aide or courtier existed. We know that they were close to that person, and so it's likely that this general or this king or whatever wanted to do this thing. But we don't
Mhm.
actually have four people from completely different backgrounds, completely different perspectives that were around this person at differing times that say he wanted to do this thing that they all word almost completely the same.
Mm. Well, I'm going to give you 15 for this round because it was again an excellent, excellent discussion, and I realize how awkward it is. People in the comments have been complaining about the fact that the scoring system is uh, it's kind of awkward. But then more people have been saying they love the format. So sometimes you just have to plow ahead with something that has clear drawbacks.
Yeah, I mean,
Cinema and theatre,
is there
world
such
affairs.
thing as objective scoring? Like that sounds pretty fanciful.
Let me tell you, there's nothing objective about these scores. In fact,
It's honest.
people who've watched all the episodes through may have even noticed a pattern in the way that I'm scoring things.
Yeah.
Comment down below if you've noticed that there's been a small amount of grade inflation, possibly since I started the show.
Oh, I see. Right.
All right, cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology?
Ooh. Um. Yeah. None of this is really what I'm inclined towards.
Well, it's a good thing that you're blazing ahead with such high scores in the first two rounds.
I am going to I'm going to forego epistemology.
Mm-hmm.
And is world affairs like current events? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah.
I'm going to go with cinema and theater.
We have lost the communal experience of storytelling. Casting should reflect demographic realities. Or adaptations, sequels, and remakes stifle originality.
Okay. I am going to argue against casting should reflect demographic realities. And
right,
I think this might be the most concise argument that I've had so far on this gauntlet.
We can win back some time, maybe.
Demographic realities can also be rephrased as sort of like the average of the population, the most common. So this is almost baiting one to defend that there should be a majority European cast for a European movie. Or if something's set in the past, then
there's kind of two ways to take this, right? That you could either say the casting should reflect the demographics of the place where the film is being made or broadcast. Right. On the other hand, you could say casting, if it's a piece based in real life, real history, it should reflect the demographics of the story that's being told.
Right, yeah. So, if it was Arthurian England, you would not want, say, Han Chinese portraying King Arthur. You would want someone with a more Celtic admixture, potentially.
Right.
And my argument against the first one, the idea that it should reflect, the society around us currently, is that if we wanted to take this demographic reflection to its, to sort of where it will lead, this strict adherence to what is
Are you there, Turnip? I think I've lost you. Hold on. I'm going to pause the recording again.
Still here?
I can... Oh, yeah, sorry. I missed you for a second.
Sorry. Okay. So if you take this demographic reflective idea to its very strict adherence, the vast majority of stories are told about something heroic, and only a few of those are about the average person. And that's a very modern category. This idea that the average person is heroic due to some sort of unique action. Usually it's something about nobility, something about being divinely chosen, or whatever else. So that's really what I'm trying to discuss here is this the stories that deal with actual heroism and not just necessarily the average, much less the the filth of like sitcoms and whatever else. I don't think that we're concerned about demographic portrayal and the sort of more low quality media. Nonetheless, it's entertaining. Um, if I have a heroic story that requires a cast, I want people that look heroic to portray it. I don't want the average American to portray like a Civil War general or a hardy frontiersman from the colonies that may have defended his village against several raids by the native Indians. I would want
Mm.
someone that looks heroic, that looks imposing, looks strong, looks intelligent. And that's just not demographically what exists around us in any country. The average person is average. They're not heroic.
Mm.
They're the face in the background that does something worthwhile too. You can't have a society made only of heroes, but they're not the people of which stories are told about. Um, so disregarding that sort of subgenre of the average person, I would not want I would not want demographics to impose itself upon the heroes. Um, and then talking about the sort of a historical portrayal, the stories that we have mostly from history deal with the heroic, and the same thing would apply here. I would not want someone that looks like a German peasant, say, to portray Barbarossa. So,
Well, now, is there a place though for, because this round is cinema and theatre. So
right.
if you suppose you are a I don't know, you you're you're a Jamaican, right? You're going to
Hmm.
put on a performance of Macbeth.
Sure.
And the people, the of among the actors who audition, they're the people you're going to pick are probably not going to reflect the the ethnic makeup of the original setting of the
Yeah,
Shakespeare play, right?
they're not going to be medieval Scots, right?
Yeah, but there's still a lot of value, I would argue, in putting on Macbeth as
Yeah,
with the group of people that you have available to you.
right. And so this is I'll temper my statement earlier. So if I am just say it's just a group of people in a community that just wants to put on Macbeth. And
Hmm.
obviously, we're in Jamaica. We're not going to find a medieval Scotsman anywhere near, nor are we going to find a medieval Scotswoman. So um, that's just off the table. So what do we do? Well, we don't pick any old Jamaican just because of skill necessarily. Assuming you filtered out people that can actually act, that
Right.
can memorize lines and whatever else, and we're just down to the people that are relevant. For
Uh-huh.
Macbeth, you're going to pick someone who is imposing, someone that might be somewhat of a pushover to a more assertive and corrupting woman that's next to him. Someone that
Hmm.
we could believe that this would happen to. You're not going to pick the absolute strongest and iron-willed person from the community to play Macbeth, only to have him sort of advised into murdering friends and courtiers on the advice of like uh, an ugly and sort of unassuming woman. That you wouldn't
Hmm.
pick that. You would
Hmm.
pick people that fit the roles, of which most stories, including Macbeth, if we're say talking about Jamaicans, the roles that we'll find in Macbeth are not demographically average.
Very good. All right. Well, look, I think to win ourselves back a little bit of time, I'm going to give you 14 points, and we can move on to the next round.
Awesome.
Psychology, elite theory, or theology?
Hold on. Let's see. Um, Theology is going to be a whole can of worms that I am, quite frankly, just not equipped to deal with extemporaneously here. Um, Psychology, I don't typically like to do, so I think we're going to go with elite theory.
Great. Populism is a delusion. Elite rule is an inevitable feature of organized society. Or crises are manufactured to redistribute power upwards.
I'll take the middle one. Elite rule is an inevitable feature of organized society.
Great. Go ahead.
Alrighty. So, and I'm going to go about this probably from a slightly different direction than most of the other people in our sphere.
Ooh.
And I will just talk about an essay from Rothbard at the end of his collection, Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. I think the last essay in there, close to the last essay, he is dealing with primitivism and the New Left, and the sort of a leftist romantic idealization of sort of tribal society and pre-modern society as a more egalitarian and a society in which power was more distributed. They would take this as an ideal. Rothbard's critiquing that. He's also critiquing primitivists. And the main mode of attack that he goes through throughout that essay is elite theory. And he will say that any society can only function because it has people that rise to the top and do the administrating, the actual ruling, and it has people that decide things. This would be the elites, the people that decide things, that rule. It is always going to be a minority of the society. And why is that the case? And Rothbard gives the example of a very measly chess club. And in this example of the chess club, Rothbard outlines that if everyone had to do administrative tasks by majority rule or by some other method that didn't involve someone just choosing or taking executive action or whatever else, the only thing that this chess club would do would be administrative work. They would not do any actual chess. They would not do any actual tournaments. They would not do much learning. They would just be administrating the ins and outs of running the chess club forever.
Yeah,
so
that sounds about right.
And yeah, anyone that's been to like church council meetings or any sort of like communal bureaucratic organization knows that this is what it tends towards. You know, if the more people that want to say, the longer that the meetings will take and the less that gets done in a meeting. This is the practical reality of a sort of minority elite group rising to the top to administrate things. Just because that is the only way that anything can actually happen. And if you wanted to be sort of evolutionary about this, you can say, well, you know, I don't have to follow that rule. I'm going to found this perfectly democratic or perfectly populist organization where we require unanimity with everything. We vote on every single decision and whatever else. You're going to be beaten out by a group that does not do that, quite frankly. This is that's sort of socially Darwinistic, but that's just what's going to happen. So if we have two rival chess clubs, one of which is perfectly populistic, no elites, all they're going to do is administrate. Whereas if we have a chess club that has like an officer corps of two people, a president and a vice president, one to stand in for the president to make all executive decisions. Even if that president is god awful, they're going to have more chess playing than the purely populistic chess club. So there's a practical reality here that a minority, specifically, it has to be a minority, because if you have a majority or anything above just a tiny amount of people from this group administrating, little is going to be done. And this makes this sort of elite administration of reality, just due to practicality.
There's a perspective from Pareto that the concentration depends on the group size, and it's a fairly sort of stable, predictable mathematical formula. But do you think that there is some variation that you could have slightly different methods of administration that would lead to either the group of elites being, say, a factor of 10 larger or smaller? So in both cases a minority, but still there being quite a difference between whether there's 10 people or 100 people making the decisions for 1,000.
Yeah. Of course there will be, and it could be by like regulation or statute. So I'm sure there's probably more than just one guy making decisions for, say, an insurance company, a very highly regulated industry. And that there's probably more decision makers in an insurance company now than there would have been 100 years ago. So that's one reason why this would be, is just strictly regulation and statutory law. But a different reason that this could be is because the leaders in this large association, maybe they're just not as competent dealing with absolutely everything as some other people are. And for whatever reason, people want them to be the leader, or they're the most competent in one particularly necessary field, so they become the leader. They can distribute decision-making power for one area to other people. But the fact, if they over-distribute, then we end up back with the chess club that only does administrative tasks. But if they distribute to some people, that decision-making power has been entrusted to those people, and they now make decisions, which itself was a decision made by the leader. So there's absolutely room for that to be the case. It's just that if it's over-distributed, this decision-making power, or if it's over-regulated so that too many people have to do administrative work, there's going to be some way to get around that in terms of regulations, or there's going to be some competing group that doesn't have to distribute this many decision-making prerogatives. And that group is going to just be better, just due to the fact that it does its purpose more.
Of course, there's this idea
what I would say.
that with Rome, there was a there was a system that was to some degree democratic, and then because of an emergency, a wartime situation, they temporarily elected somebody to have dictatorial power for the duration, and that Caesar then never gave up his power. But I think that's interesting that there was an acknowledgement to some degree, therefore, that in extreme circumstances, what's needed is a concentration of power, a centralization. And I even think this little fable is told as a warning that there are unfortunate secondary consequences of allowing a dictator, but kind of it's almost like nobody really disputes the wisdom here, that if you're at war, you need to concentrate power to have effective decisions being made. And you think, okay, wouldn't effective decision making also be useful at peace times? So it's kind of this Rothbardian point. He's kind of it is somehow deeply intuitive and ingrained, and I think people kind of know this upside, but the thing that they're worried about is that they still have this very strong democratic egalitarian ideal that they've been inculcated to.
Right. And when I was little, like in elementary school, whenever you would do this, or at least the school I was at would do this thing where you would show the here's the pros and cons of each different system. This is the one that we have. It's democracy or representative republic with democratic elements or whatever else. Here's the pros
wheel
and
out
cons.
the Churchill quote.
Right. And they'll show you the different things, and every single time someone would say, or we would be told that this popular figure said that it's really, really inefficient and that there are better systems for doing things, and you individually can decide whether doing things is a good or a bad thing for a organization like the government to do. But every single time it was always critic against democracy says that democracy is slow and inefficient, and that our enemies are more efficient, they can make decisions faster, and they're more effectively carried out. And every single criticism of that critique would always begin with "yes, but."
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
and then most honest liberals, or even someone like Rothbard, would say, yes, that is the case, but here's why you don't want that, or here's why it's morally wrong, or something like that. There's always an acknowledgement that that is a reality. It just turns into a question of value analysis. Do you want that? So the fact that this is the case is almost undisputed. I've been seeing more and more as I've gotten older, people saying that, people deluding themselves, rather, that democracy is this very efficient system and does things better. But no one believes that. And just asking an American about their trip to the DMV will tell you why democratizing something bureaucratic or giving too many decision-making powers to people that don't need them is a bad thing. They will admit that readily, whenever you have to do something regarding your driver's license or getting a vehicle permit or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like I live in a sort of slightly unresolved or kind of complex mental state when thinking about this, because on the one hand, I think a lot of the criticisms of democracy are valid, kind of public choice
Mm-hmm.
theory wing of libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, I also increasingly think that the democratic system is a show, which is more the NRX line, where
Right.
the actual decision-making mechanism is behind closed doors and more or less ignores the supposed, the stuff you learn about in civics is
Right.
kind of it's intangible and doesn't even exist in some ways. Or if it does exist, it's only in control of a small percentage of the decisions and not the decisions that matter. And I guess I've kind of if I was to boil down my conclusions, it would be that the democratic mechanism is really a story or a fiction or a fable in the minds of the public, and it does matter. The reason it matters is because it means that the leaders have, in some ways, more power because the people are sort of pacified and will go along with things that they otherwise wouldn't, believing that they sort of asked for it. It's like if you convinced somebody that it's like if you brainwashed your children into thinking that they asked to have more vegetables with their meal last week, and they're like,
Right.
I don't remember asking this, but I guess maybe I did. I guess I'll eat the vegetables then. That's the kind.
Well,
but it also requires a lie in order to maintain,
sure.
which is costly.
With the NRX criticisms of democracy, this idea that it's not actually the democratic system, this ethereal entity that is the will of the people making decisions. The things that the NRX sphere critique, they're critiquing this attribution of power to these ethereal entities that don't actually exist, like the will of the people, the silent majority opinion, or something like that, or the Constitution. The Constitution is not actually doing anything; it is words on a paper that people say they abide by, or don't. This is mainly what it's critiquing. So the fact that we do still have a democratic process is true. It's just that the NRX disputes what extent of power does this democratic process have. It is indisputable that formally there is a democratic process that does have some sort of authority, and it absolutely takes much more time and bloats the administrative state than a different system would. So
yes, yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, and I'm going to give you 14 points for this round.
Awesome.
Brings us to round 5: technology, natural sciences, or Christology.
Whoa. This is
you're out of your comfort zone here.
Extremely. Yeah, let's see.
I'll be charitable to you with the scoring. Tell you what.
So is technology like this elusive software category you were joking to me about?
No, there is a literal software category in the last round.
Great. Okay. So I think I'll take technology and hope that it's about views of technology and not the is this system better than the other one?
I think you'll be happy with these.
Okay.
Automation will have a net positive impact. People will always choose convenience over privacy. Or virtual reality will pacify the oppressed masses.
Ooh, okay. I'm going to choose the first one. Automation will have a net positive impact. And I'm going to argue in favor of that.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so the first thing I would like to distinguish is is automation itself and other factors. So things that come along with automation, like business practices or whatever else, are not automation itself, and that's not what I'm considering here. What I am considering is just the machine efficiency of completing a job versus whatever came before it. And I would argue that this is absolutely a positive, And I'll even go into some of the traditionalist critiques in a moment. But the fact that we have better machine processes to complete tasks, saving us time and allowing us to further specialize into other things, more reach our potential, whatever it is that we are naturally equipped to do, is a positive thing. And we can do the famous Austrian example and look at Robinson Crusoe on the island. Just because the principle is what we enact every day. It's just that we're not alone on the island. We're accomplishing other tasks with other people. But the principle of production does not change here on the island. Robinson Crusoe must save to produce some sort of tool to better accomplish his task. And when he has that tool, like say a fishing rod or a fishing net or something, so that he can better catch more food for sustenance, increase his income, if you will. When he has that tool, his time is freed up for him to do other things and better improve himself. Whenever I have a computer to type things on instead of just a typewriter, and a computer to edit things, I can press backspace instead of marking something out on the physical paper, losing that paper space. I can better align things, have all these fonts to choose from and whatever else. Not only do I produce a superior product, but I do it faster, and I can do it more easily. I can write more, better perfect my writing than I could if I had a typewriter in the same amount of time. This is unquestionably a positive. To which a traditionalist, which I myself am, so it's not that I'm separating myself from the category, but most traditionalists would then argue that you're losing some positive aspect of this more laborious task. If you're just writing things with a pencil or a pen or a quill with ink, you're losing a more spiritual upside to this task that you don't get if you just press down keys on the keyboard. Or you can extend this to production and manufacturing. We lost something going to factories that produce textiles instead of just doing it in the home with the family unit. You'll have your wife on a loom producing things for the household. We've lost this communal nature and this more spiritual nature of the work to automation. And I would like to address first the more communal nature of work. This idea that automation necessarily atomizes people, and I would argue that this is not the case. Just for a simple reason, that if there is something that is communally lost that people want still, or that we recognize as good, maybe they didn't see it beforehand, a few generations have passed, and now we see that this more laborious task, was necessary to our communal development. It's going to be brought back, and you can see this in the dissident sphere with all these new practices emerging, trying to more involve the family in things that have long since been forgotten. Or these companies that are trying to bring back more dissonant companies trying to bring back older ways of life, bringing back old animal fat soaps and whatnot else. This thing that's been automated away nominally under the guise of efficiency. These things are being brought back, and why is that the case? It's because people see value in them. They would rather have these older pieces of technology, like these animal fat soaps that aren't the manufactured whatever chemicals that you'll find in a supermarket shelf. They would rather have that, and they would rather pay the increased price relative to the new technology. This is something that will just naturally correct itself. Just because a machine is doing something does not mean that the cost goes up absolutely for the thing that was previously happening. It just means the relative cost has gone up. It just means the new thing is more cheaper. You can still spend the same amount of money or time doing the old thing as you did before you had automation. And the price of that thing could even go down due to other factors like technological increases. So I would argue that that's a self-solving problem. That is not necessarily true, that automation destroys the communal development. We will find ways to communally develop regardless of the technology level. It's just a question of will. Do we want to do that? And a lot of the people in our dissonant spheres do want to, and that's probably why they're going to develop better than some of their modern counterparts. As to the spiritual side of automation, I can see that might be the case, but not everything has to be done for spiritual development. It could be, we need financial statements for a business, and we don't want to handwrite it with a quill and ink anymore. So people might use a computer. I don't think people would argue that there's a great spiritual loss here, what they're probably arguing is that when you journal or when you write something in a book, that you need the spiritual benefit of handwriting it. In which case, the person writing it can very well just choose to do that. That's still on the table. And in fact, it's probably even more accessible now. I'd be willing to bet that ink and some physical writing utensil is probably cheaper than it would have been 100 years ago. So these things are still on the table, and automation hasn't abolished them.
We probably wouldn't even have the table if it wasn't for automation.
Well, yeah. I have a lot more desks now than I probably would be able to have even 50 or 60 years ago. So
there is at a certain point there's diminished value in additional desks. I mean, it's 0 to 1 is a big improvement, and then beyond that, it's difficult to find much use for them. So,
very true.
One of the questions that I've been mulling over a lot recently, and in these Gauntlet episodes, is that as the world becomes materially better, which is the state of affairs that most people would prefer, if you were given a choice, you'd rather have high quality consumer goods. You'd like to be safe. You'd like to be warm. You'd like to, etc., etc.
Right.
These are the things that distinguish, for example, the life of wealth from the life of poverty. And we have exhortations in the Bible that we should try to help those in need, and that there's some expectation that a righteous life will be in a way associated with some actual material improvement in your situation. Not necessarily, but there are proverbs that talk in that direction. So there's a kind of exhortation towards a good person should want to lift themselves and those around them up out of the primitive way of life that was uncomfortable and so on. But then on the flip side, we also see that the great wealth of a person does tend to lead them towards all kinds of vices, and the society that's wealthy likewise tends to go off the rails in a somewhat predictable direction. There's the rich young ruler or whatever it is. And even from a secular perspective, I think people in our spheres are recognizing this, that there's a set, maybe you're arguing that it isn't inevitable, but there's certainly a historical correlation between the material wealth of a society and the lack of community. If you talk to people from poor parts of the world who visit the West, they will tell you in no uncertain terms that there's something missing. And it seems like it's pretty universal, that it's not just the West. Wherever you go in the world, poverty is associated with all kinds of good things to do with community and self-control and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. So I guess this is to broaden the question beyond automation, but automation, you started out your answer saying that you were discounting some of the secondary effects that might come along with automation, but is it fair to do that? Because it's a bit like saying I don't know, it wasn't I'm trying to think of a good example here. It's like a thing that you would expect. It wasn't bringing the lion cub into the house that was the problem. It was the secondary effect that it grew up and became a lion and then ate us all.
Sure.
Okay. I guess what I'm saying is, should we resist modernity in broad terms?
So if we're to take these sort of correlated effects of automation, the increase of wealth, which itself is correlated with a greater amount of vice. The way that I'm going to approach this is that say that we do have someone who has fallen prey to extreme vice that itself is associated with an increase of wealth. When that person is standing before God in judgment, it's not going to be said that the wealth caused you to sin. It's going to be that you sinned. You have committed this sin. The blame entirely falls onto him and not the wealth or the tools that created the wealth. And this is pretty widely recognized. You don't get to say I sinned less, or this sin, even though it was sin, or vice, or whatever else we want to say. It was caused by something else, so I'm only partially to blame, or whatnot else. This isn't how it's going to work. God separates, and so we should too, between the things that are surrounding this person and the things that the person actually did commit. That's sort of like the categories that I would distinguish with, and that's why I just picked automation in particular, is because sure, there will be an increased amount of wealth that comes with automation, and then perhaps more vice, but always the responsibility of the vice is on the person who falls prey to it or commits the vice. It's their lack of faith, it's their lack of wise decision making or whatever else that causes them that causes them to sin. It's their fault only. We don't get to blame it on physical material inanimate objects.
Yeah. So the phrasing of the question here is predictive. Automation will have a net positive impact. So I totally take your point about attributing blame, that it's the automation in the hands of good people will lead to good things. And I would argue automation in the hands of bad people will lead to bad things. And then it's just a question of human nature. Or maybe if you're looking at a particular group of people, it's their level of godliness to a degree. And that's why I would probably come down on the slightly pessimistic side, where we're kind of giving power and weapons to a group of people who I'm not enormously enamored with.
Sure. But then the thing that I would like to point out... Oh, sorry, are you still there?
I'm still there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I didn't know if I was afraid I might have lost connection again. The thing that I point out is that we can take a historical example that kind of illustrates that, and then I'll get to sort of the logical issue here. Calvin's Geneva was probably one of the societies with the least amount of vices. The only criticisms that anyone can really point out is if you have a theological objection to Calvin himself and the things that his people then adopted.
And
there
possibly
was certainly
that they were overzealous in punishing people, right?
Sure, but in that case, I think that'd be another theological objection, rather than just saying that.
Fine.
So you will never come across criticism that Calvin's Geneva had too much vice. That being said, that being said, Calvin's Geneva was much more wealthy and much more automated than whatever that region was doing 900 years ago. They had access to global markets. This would have been the start of the early modern era. They had access to sort of post-Renaissance machinery. They had increased division of labor on a European scale, if not beginning to be global scale. They were far wealthier than almost a millennium ago they would have been. And this is not the usual medieval trashing that you see in modern society. This is just a simple fact, and this was brought about by good people. And nonetheless, these good people, these people without vices, I guess we could say, Calvin and his Genevan followers, these people had this strict religious zealotry in an age with rapidly increasing wealth. So it's not impossible that this can happen. So in the sense that I separated the corollary effects earlier, I said, let's just deal only with automation, not the things accompanying it, is because the things accompanying it are almost a decision or a test of faith on the people who are either good or bad. The fact that the West right now is entirely degenerate and lacking any sort of virtue and completely enamored with vice is not because of the automation. And though the automation can amplify some of the effects, the evil does as well. And we can't necessarily distinguish, are things more evil now because of the automation or because people are just more evil? Because given the two things, the two questions there, what proportion is it more automation or that people are more evil? I would lean towards the latter. I would say it's just that people are far more evil. The technology is sort of like it's a secondary effect.
Well said. And I'm going to give you 15 points. Did you want to make one extra comment at the end there?
I mean, the only thing I was going to say is that someone can say I'm dodging the question, like I'm ignoring whether automation is then net positive or not. But I'm going to just then default back to my original statement that I only want to deal with automation because we can't distinguish the effects of it when compared to humanity's evil.
Yeah, I think you've laid out your position in a way that is non-dodging, if that's a word.
Sure, yeah.
And that brings us to our final round: literature, software, and mathematics, or eschatology.
Oh wow!
Yeah. Well, look, nobody ever said the Gauntlet was easy.
So it's software and mathematics. That's a
So you may get a maths question in there instead of a software, if you wanted to dodge from. Everyone's terrified of how I will judge them if they pick software, and quite rightly, because I will tear them apart limb from limb.
The mathematics part I find very interesting. I think it would be absolutely hilarious though if you picked the mathematics and it was literally just a math problem and not like a contemplative, a contemplative
right,
philosophical
some kind of calculus problem. I thought about that for maybe if I do this again next year. I thought a fun modification to the scoring system might be that there are questions of varying levels of specificity, and you get more points automatically, or maybe even a multiplier effect if you pick one with a high specificity. Because I think, in a way, anyone can ruminate on an extremely vague question.
Yes.
But needing really specific subject matter knowledge should be remunerated. So then when you're picking between the questions, it's kind of an interesting tactical thing of, I'm going to pick this topic area and I'm going to have a good chance at going for a specialist question and getting the top score that way.
Yeah. That would be a very fun addition. And you know what? I'm not a software, I'm not a programmer or software engineer. I'm not a mathematician. I think I'm going to pick that category just for fun.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a bonus point on whatever you get this round for being brave.
Has anyone else picked that category yet?
If I remember rightly, one other person picked the category, and I think they may even have asked to back out and give up.
So they weren't like a...
So looking at these topics, I mean, good luck, because these are very specific.
Woo! Okay.
So if you want to, I will let you. There's no math here. So if you want to, I'll let you roll back. But let me just read you the options. Monorepo for the win. Vim is the one true text editor, or Rust is overrated. I can give you some background on any of these if you want, but you'll be really stuck. I suspect you've not heard of these things. Is that true?
I'm assuming Rust is not talking about the sort of survival multiplayer
oxidized game. Oh no, yes, it's also not Rust the game.
Yeah, okay.
Rust is a programming language. It's very much on the ascendancy at the moment. The key property of Rust is that it allows you to it allows you to write code with strong guarantees. So people get very excited about the mathematical properties of code that's written in Rust.
Right. Okay. Okay. I will be honest. I was kind of hoping for like a philosophy of math question here, or a methodology question.
Well, that's quite understandable, because previous rounds have been quite philosophical. But you've been dropped in here. You want to re-roll?
I will bite the point hit. I will re-roll. Yeah. I was cool. I should have taken the hint that probably it was just going to be software, but oh well. I peeked in and now I've ran off.
Well, yeah, no, this is perfectly valid. Hopefully I've rolled you back here. And then sorry, there's a little bit of, there we go. Literature, software, or eschatology?
Okay. Let's go for literature.
Ironically, I have to do a bit of live coding in order to roll back. I didn't build a function to roll it back. So when it happens, I have to go in and hand edit the the data
Impressive.
structure.
Yeah.
The distinction between high and low literature, between high and low genre fiction is arbitrary. Children's literature is as complex and significant as adult literature, or censorship of literature is dangerous.
Okay. I'm very interested in the second one about children's literature. And I personally am conflicted on this, so I'm gonna have to deliberate which side I'm going to take, because there's the sort of George MacDonald, children's fairy tales and whatever else are not children's fairy tales. They're fairy tales for everyone. They existed on like a civilizational scale once upon a time. To relegate them to children is an act of evil, basically. But then, on the other hand, there's quite a lot of popular literature that, by all accounts, was meant for children. There's been severely elevated to just sort of this perpetuated infantilization of adults that I'm not the biggest fan of.
You're talking about Marvel.
Marvel, Harry Potter, all the other, the usual suspects. However, having said that, I'm now going to argue in favor of that, and it's as complex and significant. Yeah, I'm going to argue in favor of that.
All right, let's hear it.
Okay, so complex and significant. I'm assuming complex means positively complex, as in it's that's the assumption I'm going in here, not just complex for the sake of complexity, as in like grammatical structure.
I'll let you define the terms, actually. So whichever way you'd like to take it.
All right. So I'm hoping that's what complex is in. It has moral considerations that are by any means complex, things that you wouldn't just immediately have the answer to, things that might cause people to ponder. So, and then as significant, significant. That's easy. So, I am going to take the sort of MacDonald and his students approach, which I believe would include like Lewis and Tolkien. Ironic given my my very controversial opinions on the former, but I would say that all of them are absolutely correct. That fairy tales, myths, and all these other things are not just children's literature. They are meant to be civilizational in scope. Everyone is supposed to know them, and they're supposed to have a lasting effect on you into your adult life. And I would further argue for this question that relegating such things to children's literature is itself wrong. And here's the reason why. The vast majority of moral tales, which is what the most children's literature was, or as it's been classified, children's literature, it's what it was until recently, are things that once upon a time I think our society took for granted, that everyone would just know, that envy and theft are wrong, that irreverence is improper and potentially evil, that looking at hierarchy with respect is a sign of a respectable person. I think that this was perhaps taken for granted and relegated to children's literature. It's something you learn as a child, and it just stays with you forever. Which I would then argue was then diluted to, well, everyone just knows this, so I don't really have to show them the now dubbed children's literature. Few people have grown up with the sort of stories described by the Brothers Grimm. Not everyone, of course, read the bound book, but most people got the morality through stories at some point in their life prior to this generation. I would argue that this makes it very significant and almost complex as well, because then it raises the questions of, in what circumstances is theft and envy wrong? Is there such thing as good envy, good jealousy? These questions that are still hotly debated at the very least in theology, which is itself a very high level and complex field. As for significance, that cannot be understated. It is impossible to, it cannot be overstated. This idea that these early children's moral tales, once again as they've been dubbed, are absolutely vital to society. That is what shapes the morality of the society, not least because when you hear it as a child, it is going to be imprinted on you, for better or worse, for the rest of your life, most likely. So, um, I'm going to personalize this a little bit. I was raised on some of the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. I was raised on these more sort of early 20th century fiction books like Tolkien, some by Lewis. I was also raised on sort of a. Unfortunately, I think that you can say that a lot of Bible stories have been childrenified, as if they were meant for children. As a child, you're supposed to hear about, certain stories in the Bible, like Samson and Delilah or whatever else, and then people sort of just like stop going after that. They stop considering what does this account in the Book of Judges mean for us now as Christians? What are we supposed to take away from it? I don't see much pontification of that story, but I absolutely heard a lot of it when I was
not
a
viewers
child.
of Lambda Bible Study. The fine, esteemed members of my other channel's audience are amongst the elite who continue considering these things into their adulthood.
And it's a very good thing that they do. So the moral lessons that you learn within these stories shape the civilization because they shape that generation that is growing. And the fact that it happens when they're a child, I would say, is also incidental. So, and in that sense, I would argue that children's stories are complex and significant as much as adult stories. Not necessarily just because they're children's stories or because there's like better lessons had in children's stories than adult stories, or there's less morally gray areas or whatever else, but just because they are told when they are children and they're civilizational tales that have been passed down to us by people long before us. And the fact that the moral tales told within these stories will shape the civilization as that generation does things. I would say that makes children's stories perhaps even more important than the adult stories. I'm kind of mixing the idea of the genre here and the idea of when it's told, but
Sure.
I'm admitting that.
Well, I was just coming to the same conclusion actually as you were talking, that perhaps children's literature is actually more important and therefore more complex, at least to produce. If you're building a person, you're building them mentally, forming them spiritually. They're kind of this untapped ball of potential at birth, and by the time that they are through their adolescence, ideally you've formed a stable base, and they can then engage with adult literature that can be challenging and badly written, and if their base is well enough formed, it'll kind of bounce off them if it's low quality, or they can engage with it and kind of discover the best framing for their own development, their ongoing maturing. So whereas if you feed bad, misleading stories to little children, then they will absorb it unquestioningly because that's the first thing that they're receiving.
Right.
And also that. So I gather that one of the trends in children's literature in the past few years has been celebrities, right? You become a celebrity because you're an actor or a singer or something.
Okay.
And then you decide that you want to become an author. And obviously you're not going to sit and write an actual book. Instead, you're going to write this thing for the under fives. I mean, maybe we should draw a distinction between under 5 literature and literature for a 10-year-old. Maybe that's actually two very different things. But I still think even stories that are intended to be read by like little children are quite important to the development of the next generation. And you can't just you can't just arbitrarily, on name recognition alone, entrust maybe you shouldn't entrust all of the storytelling to books anyway, and maybe that's a broader discussion that we should cultivate. a personal ability to do storytelling interpersonally. But
Yeah,
certainly, I don't think I don't think it's unimportant. The things that we the stories that we tell are, because a children's story will have necessarily so few elements and be imbibed at such a critical moment. It's almost like a fine balancing act. Every word matters. Every idea and concept has to be very carefully weighed, which is not true for, if you're an adult and you're reading some colossal tome,
mm-hmm.
you don't need nearly the level of precision and care as you're sculpting it, I would argue.
Right, and you can include a lot more. There is a slight bit more like grammatical or logical complexity in adults literature, as you'd expect. When you're talking about the Count of Monte Cristo, you can include a potentially lightly veiled lesbian couple in the book without it being taken as an endorsement of that act. You cannot do that with children's literature, especially for the under fives, because if they hear this is just a thing that happens and you aren't expressly condemning it, then it's just something that's normal. And in this sense, I would say that if we're making the distinction between under fives and then like 10 and up or whatever, or 5 and up rather, I would say that under fives children's literature is far more significant than any other category of literature. And that's why you see a particularly great amount of subversion there from the typical subversive elements in societies. It's why they are pushing two fathers, two mothers, transgenders, and whatever else on under five literature.
Transgender story hour, right?
Yeah, right. And it's because if you can this is a Christian thing. Children are not blank slates when they're born. They have the law written on their hearts like every other person does.
Well,
like every other person, that law can fade as they grow older and they engage in more vice. What was that?
I'm fully won over by your argument. So, unless you have any final comments, I suggest that I give you your final score, and then we see how you've done on the high score table.
Yeah, I think I should stop eating up the oxygen. Tell me how I did, Mr. Lambda.
All right. I have to refresh this. That's another bit of coding I didn't get around to. Oh, you're at the top. You are our new winner. Turnip.
So is this a chronological
89.
scoreboard? Did AA go before me, and then he went after Poe and all of this?
No, not entirely. I can see why it's not entirely. I haven't just like carefully mapped, but people might think that I have a running score in that I can see that I'm kind of carefully weighing, but it's much more intuitive than that. So no, not everybody ends up at the top of the high score table. So you could take that as a genuine achievement. However, you should not think of yourself as being almost twice as good as Pharaoh, because he was the first guest and he fell afoul of grade inflation. Nathan Hood as well was my second guest, so you can see how there is a certain level of
I was about to say, just on a personal level, I would trust Pharaoh or our good friend Nathan to probably make the points that I did, probably more articulately and probably with a bit more sophistication. So yeah, I'm not.
Look, you have to think of my scoring system as performance art. What I'm really doing is pulling back the veil on the folly of quantification.
It's a statement.
Exactly. I'm glad you understand. But that being said, I hope that takes away not too much of your joy at having run the gauntlet and not only completed and survived, but reaching the top, the peak, the pinnacle, and becoming the new gauntlet champion.
I mean, it was an absolute delight. I'm very, very happy that I did this afternoon.
Likewise.
Yeah, there's not much better that I could have been doing. I'll put it that way.
Well, thank you very much. And if I do this again next year, then I'd love to see a second very accomplished run from you.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully I can. Maybe next year I'll try to go earlier. See if I can
see if it's an objective scoring system.
Well, yes. Let me tell you, if you want to win next year, you don't want to go early. You know, as much as people complain in the comments, I regret nothing. Je ne regrette rien with regards to the scoring system. I think, you know, I take pot shots at my own scoring system, but secretly, I think it's been a complete triumph.
Awesome.
Right.